A man thought he'd heard God telling him to quit his job and trust God for his livelihood. So he resigned and waited. Time went on and nothing happened. Eventually, the man nearly lost all his savings, his home, and almost his marriage. Afterwards, he went to his pastor for counsel. Why didn't God come through? And as they talked about it, it became clear. The man hadn't heard from God at all. He'd been suffering from a severe case of burnout. He'd interpreted his experience through the filter of his weary and exhausted mind. This man's failing was not in his commitment to God, but in the fact that he hadn't discerned his experience with someone who knew him. It's a story that reminds us why we need the church to hear and recognize God's voice. Well, let me modify that. You actually don't need the church to hear God's voice. Here, see, we remember the words of Jesus. Do you remember? He said, I'm going to send you my spirit, and my spirit's going to speak to you wherever you go. And the reason why it's better for us to have the Spirit than having Jesus is because we're not limited by Jesus's physical body. The Spirit speaks to us wherever we go, whether we're in the car, whether we're driving to work, whether we're at home. Technically, we don't need the church to hear the Spirit of God. However, we need the church to recognize and respond to it. And the reason why we do is because we don't see clearly. We can get it wrong. Our mindsets, our desires, our agendas get in the way. They create a fuzzy filter through which we see the world. The Apostle Paul wrote to the Corinthian church and he said, we don't see clearly. It's a fuzzy mirror. And because of that, everything has to be tested. We see this in this man's story. He didn't hear clearly. He interpreted what he thought he heard through his weary mind. And see, this is where the church comes into the process of hearing God's voice. People around us, people who know God, people who love us and know us are able to offer a perspective as we test our experiences. They could have said to the man, hey, have you noticed that you're really weary lately? Have you noticed you're tired? I don't think this is God. I think you just need to take a break. You see, there's safety in God's community because people can help us recognize God's voice. There's also another angle in God's community, and we see it in the pattern of the early church. One of the most famous God conversations when the Spirit had just been given to the church, and it happened in the life of Peter. He was on his friend's rooftop in Joppa and he'd been praying, and it was just before lunch, and he falls asleep and he has a vision. And he thinks that the vision is God's way of telling him that now the good news of Jesus was available for not just the Jewish people, but for everyone, the Gentiles. But the question is, how did Peter know that it was God? The vision came as a symbolic vision, and it was all about food. Now remember, Peter was on the rooftop. It was just before lunch and he was hungry. He falls asleep and he dreams of food. How did Peter know that what he heard was from God? Well, notice what God does in the story, because right at the time as Peter's reflecting on his vision, he hears a greeting at the door. Who is it? It's Romans, Gentiles. They've been sent from another man's house called Cornelius. And what we see in the story is at the time that Peter is hearing from God, somebody else is hearing from God too. This man who lives 40 kilometers away in this town of Caesarea. God speaks twice. God speaks to Cornelius and says, send people to Peter. And God brings them together and they have a conversation. What did you see, Peter? What did you hear, Cornelius? And they realize that God is saying the same thing. You see, there's safety in the discernment of the church. Every person who receives the Spirit of God can hear from God for themselves. So now we have a way of knowing when it's God. Now we have a protection against the wrong ways of thinking that we have. If only this man had seen the value of testing his experiences in community. Thanks for joining us on Everyday God Conversations today. For more on having your own God conversation, go to godconversations.com.